the Gates event
with Christopher Hedges.
We'd like to thank him very much. For coming here tonight. And speaking. Outside. So everyone can hear. Not just those with Harvard IDs. And with that, Pulitzer Prize winner. Christopher Hedges.
Thank you. I think that this movement here at Harvard is extremely important for several reasons. And I want to encourage those Harvard students who have maintained it and maintained it heroically through Thanksgiving to continue, especially over the winter break. Harvard exists essentially to feed the plutocracy, and it has since it was founded. It is an institution that epitomizes the dead ideas of the 1%. It harbors within its walls some of the most capricious and corrupt figures, Warren Summers, Robert Rubin, and others, who are responsible not only for the meltdown of wealth within the United States, $17 trillion virtually evaporating, but $40 trillion in worldwide wealth. And if there's any poetic justice, we can take heart in the fact that while they were at it, they trashed 1/3 of the Harvard endowment. This movement is important not because of its size, but because it is run by people within the institution who have access to these figures and begin to call them to account. And that's extremely important. For those of us who don't carry Harvard ID cards, we can't even get inside Harvard Yard, much less to an event that has figures like Summers or Rubin present. It is also important that this movement continues to express what I think is the fundamental message of Occupy movements across this country. And that is a message that is revolutionary. It is a message that seeks to reverse the corporate coup d'etat that has taken place in the United States. It was Crane Brinton who taught here in his great book, Anatomy of a Revolution, and his study of various revolutions throughout history that laid out what he saw as the causal factors that led to revolution. The creation of a rapacious oligarchy, destruction of a middle class, a tone deafness to the plight of working men and women, and especially the poor. Déclassé intellectuals, people who finish expecting to be integrated into the system and having nowhere to go. But Brinton also said that all revolutionary movements at their inception demand that the corrupt and decayed power elite be removed. And that demand is unpalatable to that elite because, of course, it would mean their dissolution. And the elites can't respond to that demand. So when you see outside forces tell you, what are your demands? Make demands. Do you want to revoke corporate personhood? Do you want financial reforms, regulations? Do you want campaign finance reforms? What they're attempting to do is funnel you back into that dead system. And the power of the Occupy movement is that it won't go there. It realizes a fundamental truth about American politics, and that is that there is no way to vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs, who I understand are on this campus tonight. And I am certain will not be locked out of Harvard Yard. And I think the power of this movement is such that it articulates a truth about where we have descended, not only as a nation, but as a global culture. That if we allow figures like Lawrence Summers and Robert Rubin and their courtiers in the press and the political class to continue to dominate our future, to turn everything into a commodity, human beings, who become commodities, the natural world which becomes a commodity, which they will exploit until exhaustion or collapse, will quite literally finish, not just economically, but finished in terms of the assault on the ecosystem on which the human species depends for survival. This is quite literally a fight for life. It's no exaggeration. And if you read the latest reports on the disintegrating ozone, the best climate scientists in this country say that if we do not immediately wean ourselves away from fossil fuels, 4 to 5 years from now, catastrophic effects will begin to kick in. Not just the droughts, the hurricanes, the destruction of crop yields, and agronomists have already determined that for every 1 degree rise in temperature, we see a 10% decrease in crop yields. And my friend Bill McKibben has been fighting long and hard on this. We're talking about not my future. We're talking about your future. We're talking about the future of my children, the future of your children. And so I applaud what you're doing. I stand by you. I will sleep in there tonight. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to.
How are you going to sleep in there?
I've got a yard pass, which because I'm giving a lecture. Before I came, I made sure I got a yard pass so that I can get to my lecture. The yard pass has no curfew limit on it, so I intend to use it all night long.
And thank you, Chris. What do you have to do to get that yard pass? Who do you have to talk to?
You have to get somebody to invite you to give a talk.
So I really like what you said about how Harvard students have an opportunity to hold their own people to account. I wanted to know if you had a little bit more to say about how people might go about doing that, how others might have gone about doing that, and whether this is something that other students can participate in, even though they may not have the same sort of celebrated and elevated administration.
Well, other schools already are. Of course, there's a nationwide walkout. I know Tufts has signed up for it. Unfortunately, Harvard is not. It's not a surprise, frankly, that Harvard is not. Look, there already have been. I mean, Newt Gingrich, these people should not be allowed, given what they have done, to come onto this campus with impunity and say the kind of garbage they say and not be called to account. And that is the responsibility of these students who will have access to these figures, and they all come through here, that we don't have, because we don't have that ID card. And that is their special responsibility, because no one else can do it. So they've already done some great actions. They walked out of, what was the name of that economics professor's class you walked out of? Right. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that has to be ramped up. The focus is not that encampment. That encampment is a physical presence that says we're here. But the message has to be taken out, as often as is humanly possible, to begin to confront those forces and those figures that have plunged this country and, frankly, the global economy into a tailspin, as well as those forces that continue to carry out an assault on the ecosystem itself. Remember, in the 17th century, speculators were hung, and what corporations like Goldman Sachs and Citibank are doing has been considered throughout history. And I'm not going to start speaking about classics in front of Professor Thomas, but Solon forgave all debts. When the Athenian Empire went through a very similar period where essentially the criminal class took control, and that's what we have. This institution is paying deference to individuals and to systems that commit crimes. And since they won't name those crimes, you have to name them.
You spoke at the University of Toronto last year about the withering of humanity. Sure.
My check.
You spoke last year at the University of Toronto about sort of the withering of humanities departments in universities, the withering of the classics, the doing away with the arts, and the process by which universities are turning vocational schools. I'm wondering, I know you spoke about that, or wrote about that in chapter 4 of the book class, about the I'm wondering if you can somehow that argument.
He's asking about the death of the humanities. Well, that's what the corporate state began with Carnegie and others at the turn of the century. They made war against all of those, and it's not just the humanities, but the humanities are an important part. They made war against all those forces within the society that have the power to transform. Everything had to become vocational. So that there's a huge difference between teaching people what to think and teaching people how to think. And the power of a liberal arts education is that it teaches you how to think. And this institution is being rapidly reconfigured, like Stanford and other places, into basically a glorified engineering school. And there is a very subtle and pernicious assault against those departments and those disciplines that teach people how to think, because thinking is subversive. Thinking forces you to challenge assumptions and structures and question them. And I can guarantee you, having taken Professor Thomas's Virgil course, there's more worth in that course than an entire 3 years to get an MBA or however long it takes them over there in that big Wizard of Oz building across the river. Well, I've covered movements before. I covered all of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. I covered both of the Palestinian uprisings. I covered all of the street protests that brought down Milosevic, and I can tell you, no one knows. I was in Leipzig on November 9th, 1989, with the leaders of the East German opposition, and they told me that perhaps within a year there would be free passage back and forth across the Berlin Wall. Within a few hours, the Berlin Wall, at least as an impediment to human traffic, did not exist. Week after week, month after month, these clergy in Leipzig held these candlelit vigils, and it was slow at first. People forget. Just as the Egyptian revolution has been percolating for many, many months and even years. And suddenly it began to grow, and Honecker had been ruling East Germany since the time of the dinosaurs, sends down a paratroop division to Leipzig, and they won't attack the demonstrators. It's always when the foot soldiers of the elite won't carry out the forms of draconian control that these dead regimes crumble. And that's why it is so important not to respond to police provocation and to respect the blue uniform police who are working class. In Zuccotti Park, and I'll be there Friday, let me just tell you without going into details, the Occupy movement in New York is not over. It's only begun, and they will get space back. And Friday at 10 o'clock is part of that effort, and unfortunately we can't tip Mayor Bloomberg off any more than we already have in the past. The difference between how the blue uniform police would relate to people in Zuccotti when the white shirt inspectors weren't around was quite marked. There was a lot of fraternization, and I have a very good friend who I admire immensely, John Friesen, who's in the park, comes out of Oakland, and when they came that night to clear out Zuccotti, John and another friend of mine, Zach Solomon, and others used heavy locks to chain themselves together around the kitchen, and the police, for all their infiltration and monitoring, weren't prepared for this lockdown and had to bring in an outside truck to cut these locks apart. But as John was being confronted by the police, he told me he would look at the officers' badge names to try and address them by their name and say to them, you know, you have a choice. You have a choice in what you do. Now, maybe most of them didn't hear him, but I can guarantee you some of them heard him. And that's how movements like this imperceptibly chip away at the dead edifice, because inside that edifice, they know how dead and hollow it is even more than we do, and how corrupt it is. And that's why they're so frightened.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about criminals in this university. Could you add a little bit about people like Henry Kissinger, relationship with Harvard, Robert McNamara, and other people related to the industrial complex, and the bell curve experiments, which are, racist theories?
Well, I mean, he's asking about figures like Henry Kissinger and McNamara and others who have been closely associated with Harvard. This is Harvard's role. This is what Harvard does. Harvard feeds and maintains the plutocracy it always has, and the power elite. It gives polish to figures like Kissinger and McNamara, who should spend the rest of their lives in jail and should have never been allowed to escape from the war crimes that they committed. The power of what Occupy Harvard is doing is that by subverting that narrative, they are exposing who these people are, so that when they're hissed and booed as they walk out of the economics class and they're confronted, was it by the Republican Club in their sweaters? Sort of out of Animal House, isn't it? I mean, these guys are really dweeby. And they rip that public relations facade apart, and they allow the outside world to see what's on the inside, and it doesn't look too pretty, does it?
Hey, Chris, couple things. One, what do you think is the responsibility of alumni? And this, and two, you consider giving your bed tonight to someone homeless in the square or worker,
That's a good idea. I don't know if they'll let him in the faculty club. What's the role of alumni? Well, I mean, well, I'd like to see the same thing I'd like to see against Israel, which is an economic boycott of the Palestinians. I am an alumni, and I've economically boycotted Harvard since I graduated, but that's because I don't make any money.
So you talked about treating police people as human beings, and I totally agree with that. I think that what they said, or what they must have done in Jihadi first, was pretty effective by recognizing them as human beings. But how can you justify the response to the fact that they didn't respect the protesters as human beings? How can you justify the police brutality that knocked people out and set blood?
You can't justify it. But the point is that look at the reaction when campus police pepper spray students at UC Davis. Look at the reaction when the New York City police and Inspector Anthony Bologna pepper spray women seated on a sidewalk held in by orange fencing. It is a clear indication of, and I think it expresses the dichotomy between us and them. We have something to offer. We have something to say. The only language they're capable of speaking is the language of force, and it exposes them for who they are. It's not just, and it's not fair. And as somebody who has had to struggle with PTSD, when I left to get arrested in Washington a couple of years ago, my wife's parting words when I left the house was, "Just promise me you won't hit a cop." You can't. You have to. You know, one of the things that's fascinating about when we've done these arrests in front of the White House with Veterans for Peace is that most of the Washington, D.C. police force, I think is true for many police forces, they're in the National Guard and they've all been to Iraq and Afghanistan. And they treated the veterans with incredible deference. And actually, as we had the cuffs put on our hands behind our back, a lot of the police would say, "Keep doing what you're doing because these wars stink." That is exactly, I think, a glimmer of what's happening within the structures of control. In New York City, these big financial firms like Goldman Sachs and Citibank, they hire these policemen for $37 an hour as rent-a-cops. And you can be sure that these guys in their $8,000 suits walk past them as if they're, invisible, the same way they walk past every other service industry worker inside their building. These cops aren't stupid. These cops know what's going on. They have families who have had homes foreclosed. I'm not excusing what they do. In the end, they have to make a moral decision, and a difficult decision. And yet, on the other hand, they're the weak link in the chain. And when we break that link, we win. And that has been true with every single revolution throughout human history, including the Russian Revolution, which was a bloodless revolution. The armed putsch came afterwards, led by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. The overthrow of the Tsar, not bloodless on the part of the Cossacks and the secret police and others, but largely bloodless, and that was true in Eastern Europe. It's when the forces of control send down the message to Wenceslas Square in Prague to shoot. And on the first night of the protests in Prague, they did shoot. 7 people were killed. I was there. And they won't, that it's over. And I think that this system, this corporate system, is as decayed, as corrupt, as hollow, and as vulnerable as the communist regimes that I saw topple in 1989. Thank you very much.
I'm very involved with Occupy Washington.
I can find
They want me to go to Occupy. I'm over